Hello again. I welcome you on an Ask Me Anything question from Sebastian Daschner, who will tell us about microprofile, Java EE stuff, and so on. This is a fully interactive session. There will be no classical slides talk. You can just ask your questions at the right in a Q&A session. Sebastian will read them and answer. That's it. The best question in this Ask Me Anything session will be gifted a book. So Sebastian, you should choose the best question, and nice. We'll gift that person a book. Let's start.
Yes, and hi from my side as well. So thank you very much for the introduction. And I'm very looking forward to this interactive session. So especially since I was asked to join here for the online conference, and I thought, because I already have a lot of enterprise-related material out there in my channels, that I specifically wanted to help you with the questions that you might have when implementing enterprise Java applications. So with all of the things I've been doing in the past, and with books about Java EE back then, now it's Jakarta EE, microprofile, Quarkus, OpenLiberty, and all these technologies, I want to have the session to help you a little bit on all the things that you might struggle with. So I would just share a little bit about which technologies I'm mostly using on the Java side. And I hope you can see just these websites. So this is actually Jakarta. If you're wondering what that is, Jakarta is basically the successor of Java EE that has been moved to the Eclipse Foundation. So now it's fully open source, open governance model for the future of cloud native Java. That's how it is called. It's basically a set of APIs, and you probably know Jakarta already if you've used something like CDI or JXRS or JPA. That's all part of Jakarta. Then there's a thing called microprofile. If you wonder how that works together, microprofile basically has emerged when, in order to progress back then, Java EE a little bit more, and it is has been used to fill the gaps a little bit with specifications that are more towards cloud native technologies such as metrics and health checks and things like that. There's support for a lot of more modern APIs with a faster pace. So actually, if that is a question I get quite often, so what is the is it Jakarta versus microprofile or something like that? Well, no, actually microprofile is based on Jakarta or Java EE technology as well. So if you look at the website, things like CDI, JXRS are there as well. So it's basically, it plays along together. It just adds some other components as well. And I usually, in my projects, use a combination of both. And most people don't even care if it's, what is Jakarta, what is microprofile. The combination of both is really powerful, because then you can have a lot of technology for cloud native apps. Two more things I want to show you, which are very modern runtimes to run a modern cloud native based enterprise Java. So one thing that you probably have heard about is this Quarkus technology, supersonic subatomic Java. That is a framework, or basically an enterprise runtime, that is also based on, Jakarta APIs, microprofile APIs, and it also ships with a few own APIs to make, a better developer experience for modern cloud native applications, and also optimize then for cloud native and containerized runtimes. So it means a lot of the things that we have back then in a typical application server are just boiled down. So your apps only contain what you really need at runtime. And it is actually very fast and very resource efficient to run Quarkus applications. And if you have experience with enterprise Java, then there's a high chance that you know most things already. You can just write CDI code and JXRS and all these APIs again, and write a Quarkus application. And the last thing I want to show you that's also a very interesting runtime, an open source enterprise runtime called OpenLiberty, which originally emerged from WebSphere Liberty, which came from the old WebSphere world. But this luckily is very modern and fast. It's actually very, very fast runtime. And it is especially interesting for projects who have existing knowledge and existing investment in enterprise Java, and some projects that use, for example, J2EE in the old world, or JEE as Java EE, to migrate them to a more modern stack. So this is also very modern runtime. I use it a lot as well for just applications that use Jakarta and microprofile. So it fully supports everything that Jakarta ships with. So also, some more legacy APIs like EJBs and other things that you might have in your application if it's an older one. And it also supports everything of microprofile. So this is really cool technology to work with as well. And that's basically the things I want to introduce in the beginning. So I hope you have some questions that we could talk about. So whether it's about how to write efficient enterprise tests, like the topic of testing, I think is always an important one. Whether it's about choosing specific technologies, or what my experience is on some specific thing. So you could use either the public chat here. So just write something into the chat window. I'm just doing that right now. And you can also use the Q&A section here in the chat. I was just looking at the Q&A. No, there's one, but that's an older one. And you can go into the public chat or Q&A if you have some questions, or you can just use the chat to say hi. It's always cool to see some interaction from all of the attendees. You can tell where you're currently located. And the idea is to make this session as interactive as possible. So that's the plan. Other than that, about myself, if I can also briefly introduce myself. So I usually now do work as a so-called developer advocate. So most of the work that I'm doing is somewhat teaching developers about enterprise software. So I mostly have a focus on enterprise Java because of my background in helping shaping the future of enterprise Java. And back then it was Java EE, now Jakarta EE, microprofile, and all of the things that typically an enterprise project needs. So this is my focus. So it's not just about some hype technology. I always try to keep it for, like real world projects that people and clients and customers actually use and need, because this was always my focus, also from my consulting background. Hey, Coffee Jug says hi. Thank you. Like hi back to Lviv in Ukraine. That's cool. And yes, so if you have some questions, just type them in.
2 questions already in Q&A session.
Yes. Oh, the first one was also okay. So first question, what I wasn't sure if it was from the old talk, but yes, this is the also one. What do you think about Kotlin and native as a competitor to Quarkus and GraalVM? Yes, so about like competitor and to be honest, there are a few things involved here with all of the in general, trying to natively compile Java, and this is the same issue or challenge that people have. Like, I'm not that familiar with Kotlin and the native way but in general, if you run a traditional Java app or enterprise Java app, the issue that we have once we try to run something as a native compilation like GraalVM, if you would just take your random application and try to compile it natively via Graal, you might have challenges. Why? Because most of the frameworks and technologies that we're using in the enterprise world rely on functionalities like more advanced reflection and some bytecode mechanisms and whatnot that are not available or not necessarily available in all of these native and optimized runtimes, such as GraalVM. So if you would just take a project such as OpenLiberty and just run it natively, that would not work. So some things would be missing. And this is actually what Quarkus put a lot of work into for the build time optimization. So what Quarkus is doing, the main work is done at build time. So when you do a Maven build, like please build my project, there is a plugin that basically scans everything in your code and does a similar work what your application server would do, but at build time already. So then in this case, once you start your application later on, you don't have to do all of the annotation scanning and see, okay, where are my beans and things like that. That already has been done at build time. And then you come up with highly optimized code already. And now the point is, only because of that build time optimization are we able to compile it down to native code using Graal, or actually, potentially you could use anything else. So the biggest work that Quarkus has been put in, or the somewhat innovation, if you want, the big innovation is the build time optimization, not necessarily Graal. It's, just in quote unquote the last step of the native compilation. But in order to be able to use it natively with the simplified and optimized code that is produced, we have to do all of these build time scanning. So this is actually the point behind Quarkus. And well, that's what I think about it. So it's not really a competitor, right? It's more about, you have to put in the work that an application server would do at runtime, or that Quarkus would do at build time, in order to be even able to run it either in an optimized way or run it natively. Actually, I mostly run my Quarkus applications not even natively. It's not a requirement. You don't have to run it with GraalVM or with native. I actually mostly use OpenJ9 or any other OpenJDK based Java. Really doesn't matter, and it's already optimized. Because if you do the build time optimization, you come up with optimized code, which is good. And then you can start it using Java, or you can go further and say, okay, now take this optimized code and try to come up with a native image. So I'll just mark the question as answered. I hope that works. If not, please follow up in the chat. And next question. Is modern Java EE contains any result of Graal's old J2E standards, or for now it's only representation of existing industry trends? Yes, so that's a good question. So right now the Jakarta, first of all, they are trying to get rid of some of the old stuff. So this has basically been a long discussion, like what should be introduced and what not. The question comes from the background because traditionally Java EE or J2EE always carried around all the standards that have been done in the past. So you can rely on what I've done 5 years ago still works, which is good for a lot of companies. But at the same time, while we want to be innovative, and if all of the runtimes have to support all of the old stuff, then you come up with very bloated runtimes. So it is a trade-off. And there have been some, optimizations or a lot of thoughts, especially with Jakarta EE9, to say, okay, can we remove or mark as optional a lot of these APIs that are really, not used anymore that much. So even something like SOAP, people are complaining, okay, that's, like a little bit too heavy. Things like Corba, things like XML, RPC, and, all the APIs that people really don't want to use, like in a normal, a modern project. And I think this really makes sense to say, you can mark it as optional, and runtimes don't have to support it in order to be certified, right? Because then you can say you can carve out different, standards or different sets of the standard, like of Jakarta. And to say, the smallest or most modern set is only the things that we really need because it's modern. And then I like what runtimes such as Liberty are doing, because if you still have a project that needs the old API, then you can add it via a module. Maybe it's not, standardized, because not all of the application servers support that or runtime support that, but that's okay, because if you have, a more legacy project, then probably you don't want to or cannot migrate to the latest stuff anyway, but at least you have a modern runtime that is still supported and still have security patches that runs your application. And then slowly you can carve out the old code and, migrate it away, but that is still supported. So this is somewhat the what is going on, basically. So yes, there have been a lot of thoughts around this, and the folks behind the Jakarta standardization are trying to make it in a reasonable way to say, okay, we don't want to break the whole world, throw out everything that people still use, but there are some APIs where it's a really questionable, where you say, okay, either you don't want to use it anymore or you don't want to use it in a new world. And the good thing is it's still a standard. It doesn't disappear, right? You can still read the standard specifications. And if you have a runtime that supports it, that's okay. That's great for your project and you can use it, right? So that's there's nothing that is lost. So that's okay. All right, so I'm not familiar with Java EE, so question what Java libraries can be useful for new Java applications and what benefits it provides against competitors like Spring. Yes, so this is a good question. I often get this question like, why should we care about EE? How much is it better than Spring or not, and this and that. So I would say as of today, for a normal enterprise application, and this means like 99% or whatever, or maybe more than 90% of the applications, it really doesn't matter whether you use Spring, whether you use modern EE like Quarkus or Liberty, or actually something else, as long as it supports what you're trying to do, or A, and B, if you're familiar with the APIs. So in other words, it really doesn't matter. Can you use Spring to write a modern application? Yes, of course. Can you use Quarkus or Liberty to write a modern cloud native application? Yes, of course. So it is much more about what are you familiar with. So what the developers in your team are familiar with, and what you're more productive with. So maybe which API you prefer more, because Spring has been around so long and became a de facto standard in the Java ecosystem. It also won't go away, right? The problem is only if you rely on libraries that some random person like myself, if I put something on GitHub, well, you don't know if I still maintain it tomorrow, right? But behind it, if there's a technology where there's a huge interest behind it and practical interest, right? Nowadays, companies care less about actual standards, like like certified standard, like Java EE was. So people use Spring, and they don't care. Or is it official standard or not? Who cares? It's widely used and it's de facto standard and it's there. So that's great. And of course, the same for the official standard like Jakarta. And it is just a question: is it maintained? Is there enough interest to get support and help if I have to use it tomorrow and if I have a problem? And if that is the case, well, yeah, then go ahead and use it. Are the APIs, usable? Are they well specified and well documented? So these are more the questions. And both is definitely the case for Spring and modern enterprise Java like Jakarta and MicroProfile. And I would say, there's less a pro and con. You can use both and just use whatever you're more happy with. So I personally really like the APIs, especially around CDI. So I think CDI is a big plus in enterprise Java. So I like the dependency injection a little bit more, and the whole scope system and qualifiers than what Spring provides. But it's like a tiny difference, whatever you prefer. But I think especially CDI is very powerful, and that's the core of EE apps, and the same for JAX-RS. I not only say this because I helped being in the expert group who that standardize it, but it's just a very nice, declarative API for RESTful web services. And these are just examples that I mostly use. And I really like, the declarative part of these APIs. And that's why I, slightly prefer to go with enterprise Java. But nowadays people, care less about standards, but it's definitely a good thing to have, and you can use basically both. So I would say it's less a competition, like both exist and both always have benefited from each other, and which was always a good thing. So yeah. Another question. Are there any common recommendations for migrating to modern EE technology stack? As an example, if we're talking about Spring, there was a roadmap for old applications, migrations for big customers. Yes, so recommendations for migrating. Two things. First of all, let me quickly talk about migrating old EE apps like J2EE or Java EE apps to a modern stack, because that's somewhat different if you would migrate from Spring to a different stack. So if you would migrate from an old stack, then it always depends, the effort that you have to put in is how close you were to a standard to a standard proper approach of implementing applications. Or in other words, if the more vendor specific you were, so let's say you were using, I don't know, old WebSphere and you used some WebSphere specific features, then of course it's much harder to migrate away, because the new runtime, even if it's a new version or, might not support it. So that's the thing. So the closer you were to just standard CDIs, or back then EJBs, then it's much easier typically, or from experience, to migrate. because then, you would just adapt the parts in your API, and hopefully your business logic is very concise and not much interwoven with the J2EE framework or the Java EE APIs back then that you used, and then it's somewhat straightforward. What I mostly recommend in these cases, but it really depends on your actual context, is to stay with a runtime that is somewhat close to what you used before. So a very good example for that is if you used old WebSphere and then the new WebSphere Liberty, which fortunately has nothing to do with the old world. So the new Liberty is really fast. It's a very modern runtime, but it still has components for old APIs. So even if you were using some old stuff, like vendor-specific or WebSphere-specific things, you still can get support and can add them. Well, it depends on the feature, but for most of it, and get support still in a modern runtime, which is really nice because then you get the modern runtime and you don't have to migrate everything at once. So it's somewhat a smoother transition if you use a newer version of an older application server that you have been used. So this is the case. And in general, it's more about the API usage. The closer you were to the standards, the better. Now, to answer the question for Spring, for the Spring migration, if we talk from Spring to EE, then it also depends how much, like Spring specific things you had, like, because there are many Spring like integration parts with, I don't know, you could integrate social media and Facebook and whatnot, and, all kinds of cloud connectors. So that just depends. But from experience, the better your code quality is, which usually means that you should abstract away some very specific things, right? Like a specific connector or, specific framework from your core business logic, then it should, or from experience, it is not that much effort to actually migrate it. Because, for example, it is possible to run Spring applications both in Liberty and in Quarkus. I mean, with some stars or with some caveats or with some extra warning attached to it, and not just out of the box, but they support some annotations, for example. So initially you don't have to throw away or migrate all of the code, and you can have a smoother transition as well to say, okay, some whether you write at autowired or at inject sometimes doesn't matter, and things like that, where it's a smoother transition. And if you were very close to a straightforward standard, so for example, in Spring, if you have a lot of add components or add service, well, then you could take modern CDI, you make an add application scope out of it, and usually you're already very good to go. And the same for producers and things like that. So there's a lot of straightforward patterns that you can just follow if you know both APIs, and that's mostly straightforward if you were kind of close to the standard. And since Spring applications tend to be a little bit more modern from experience, what I've seen, just because it's a little bit more modern than old Java J2EE. Usually there's also less very specific or very entangled code. So then it's shouldn't be too much, or usually it shouldn't be too much of an issue. All right, I just have a quick look into the chat. What is there, and then we go for the next question. I'm very happy that we have a lot of question here. Does modern J2E provide facilities to work with non-JMS messaging systems like Spring messaging does? Not the standard, which like not the standard of Jakarta, which I can say, well, is usually not a problem, or shouldn't be a big deal. Why? Because it depends what actually you want to use, and B, the thing is, all the APIs that are part of Jakarta are meant to be standards that stick around for longer, right? And if you have a specific technology like Kafka, the question is, I mean, I like Kafka, but to say, who knows if it's still around in that a potential future, or if one more vendor specific de facto standard is still around in the future, or should be treated in the same way like a standard, like JMS can basically abstract many different implementations, which is always the challenge of putting something into Jakarta, like into the official standard. To say, should we support it, or is it actually a reasonable thing to do? We had many discussions around that with hypermedia formats, and with to say, about YAML or not. And always, if you go into like more modern technology, it is just a balance. What you can look into for this specific thing is actually microprofile messaging and reactive messaging. Just have a look at the name, specifically the name for that, because then microprofile comes with some APIs that kind of de facto standardize more the reactive part, and then that's the answer, actually depends on the implementation. But yeah, we have microprofile reactive streams, for example. But then I can say the modern implementations, they all support like, a messaging solution in their own way. So either, via macro profile project, which is actually good because then it's somewhat, de facto standard or standardized, or you don't have to use a vendor specific API, or at least, get access to it via an API that is shipped with your runtime. So either Liberty or Quarkus also supports that. And then, in the worst case, quote unquote, you just have to use a more vendor specific API or more framework specific API, which is the same like you would do in Spring, right? So then, you use something that Spring ships with for RabbitMQ integration or Kafka or whatever you want to use. And then it is the same. So as the answer, all of the modern runtime support something like that. And depends on your use case, you might be able to use a microprofile standard or microprofile project if that is also supported in your runtime, and then I would just go with that. But for these reasons, plain Jakarta EE does not provide that yet for because then you would need to agree on a specific standard or what to go with. All right. How does Java EE support, or I read it as Jakarta EE, support current architectural trends like microservices and reactive services? Yes, so with microservices, well, I would have a counter question, for you, what is a microservice, or, like what are you specifically targeting? Are you targeting, the way of deploying it? Because that's not really actually mentioned in the specification. You can totally well deploy a single service that just contains your app, so you don't have to go with the old-fashioned application server model where a lot of applications are deployed to the same server. So that's actually very outdated. For a long time, we just ship one application within one runtime, right? Even though something like Liberty, it can run many apps, but mostly you just go with the way one app has a dedicated like runtime, and that's just it. For the deployment model. And for anything else, microservices, it's actually very well supported, and also the cloud native technologies are very well supported in actually also all the Java EE. Because what is a nice story behind the deployment model is that it was always the case that you could separate the implementation from your app. For example, with the WAR file, that you say you have a WAR file that just gets deployed to a runtime, or to another with this hello jar or hello war with another implementation, which is actually very nice for a containerized world, because then you have the caching layer optimization of Docker and container technologies, which really make a huge difference, that make your builds and your deployment much more efficient. So this is nice support of microservices as well. And just in general, it is more about the runtime. So I can say that microservices are very well doable with modern runtimes like Liberty or Quarkus, because they can just be boiled down to contain only what your application needs, especially with the runtime perspective, how to run and how to deploy it. So I always ship like Liberty apps with only one application, although the server could handle more, but that's not really used anymore. So this is this is definitely possible, like anything microservice related. And if you check out my blog and just Google my name and blog, then in the last years I wrote a lot of content and created some videos like how to basically do modern microservice deployments with Java EE, and now it's called Jakarta EE, and also my book, Architecting Modern Java EE Applications. So it also still has Java EE in the name, but you can replace that name in your head. It also shows, like, that was the whole point, to show that it's actually possible to do modern microservices with modern enterprise Java technology, and then definitely works. For, yes, reactive services, especially reactive messaging and all of these technological integrations. That's basically what I answered in the last question. It's, yeah, that is more runtime specific. So there is not like that much in the plain Jakarta standard yet. There are some micro-profile projects that go and implement some more standardized APIs for doing things that try to combine what all of the vendors or all of the runtimes are doing, which is very good. But other than that, the point is of the more modern enterprise Java runtimes, they do support it, like reactive messaging, and then you do have the integration of Kafka or Rabbit or whatever you want to use. So that is definitely the case and definitely given, because yeah, as I said before, it's both possible to do modern cloud native microservices with either Jakarta or Spring, of course. So that works. All right. So we have a lot of questions being answered.
I think that was the last question, because we are pretty tight on time. Now to the interesting part. Okay. You should choose the best question and try not to choose one of mine questions, because it wouldn't be fair. And the person who has the best question will be gifted a book from Manning Publications about classical computer science problems solved in Java.
Nice. I would have to think. I actually really like the question, like I think it was the last one that I read from Ivan, like how Jakarta supports current architectural trends like microservices and reactive services, because first of all, I got this question a lot, and this question always needs to be asked, like also for people who standardize it, in order to put a little bit more pressure. So that's good, right? Like basically asking a question like, hey, how should we care? We have this modern world and modern architectural influences, or we want to do microservices. Is it possible? And yes, if yes, then tell me how, right? Like also how to do the documentation, how to improve things like that, how to come up with some standards that support reactive messaging. So yeah, I like that question, especially if you ask it in a more forcing way to say, hey, how can we improve the world? So I really try to do that as well. And
nice. So my congratulations to Ivan. The book goes to him. And now we have a break, like about half an hour. What you all can do at the break, I mean, both speakers and attendees, is two things. First, you can go to special chat. The link is in your inboxes on email. It's a special collaborating, I would say that it's an audio virtual reality collaboration platform where you can move your pin around the map and listen and talk to other people. It's really interesting. You guys should check it. And the second question, thing that you can do is to go to the Miro virtual booth and try to solve one of their quizzes. Try to write some code on Kotlin for a widget and won some prizes. Thank you, Sebastian, for a great AMA session. We have really interesting questions and insightful answers. And see you all in half an hour. Yeah.
Thanks for having me.
Bye.
Bye-bye.